One of my favorite things about being with all of you here at Miller Street is that we talk about the Bible. I mean, we study and we read, and we've kind of challenged each other to become daily Bible readers, and we end up with some really interesting discussions in class. And about a month ago, we had a discussion about Jacob wrestling with the angel, and we were all pretty straightforward that it seemed like an odd interruption in this account of what was going on in Jacob's life. And so, he's on his way home. He's stressing about seeing his brother Esau again, and suddenly there's this encounter with an angel. But once you consider what had just happened to him, which we're going to look at briefly this morning, and what was about to happen, you begin to realize this account has some important things to teach us. Jacob, this is the part that doesn't always stick in my mind. He had spent many, many years under the shadow of his father-in-law. I don't know if you remember, he went out and met his wife and was kind of tricked and ended up with two wives, and it was kind of a complicated situation. They kind of got off on the wrong foot, and ever since, the tension had been building between them and the two families, and there was a lot of conflict. I'm going to be in Genesis 31 to begin with, and mainly in that area this morning. If you want to read along with me, I'm going to be in the area of Genesis 31 the rest of the time. In fact, if you go to Genesis 31, starting with verse 1, Laban is his father-in-law, and so there's this tension been building in this family. Jacob heard that Laban's sons were saying, "Jacob has taken everything our father owned and has gained all this wealth from what belonged to our father." And Jacob noticed that Laban's attitude toward him was not what it had been. It was, off to a rocky start to begin with, and now it's even worse. And the way things are going, everything could have turned out very bad for him, but God has a plan for Jacob. Here's verse 3, Genesis 31:3. Then the Lord said to Jacob, "Go back to the land of your fathers and to your relatives, and I will be with you." So God is ready to stand with Jacob, but it's important to notice something about Jacob, and I think this is pretty key when you read this. Jacob hasn't made the decision to really stand with God. I don't think so anyway, based on some of the things I notice. It's easy to miss that God and Jacob aren't that close. Here's Genesis 31, verse 4. He's talking to Rachel and Leah, his wives, and it says in Genesis 31, verse 4, "So Jacob sent word to Rachel and Leah to come out to the fields where his flocks were. He said to them, 'I see that your father's attitude toward me is not what it was before, but the God of my father has been with me.'" And you'll notice that he says, "the God of my father." He doesn't say "my God," he says "the God of my father." His dad had a personal relationship with God, but apparently Jacob doesn't. There's a connection there, but maybe a little distance too. He knows God's involved. Here's verse 6. "You know that I've worked for your father with all my strength, yet your father has cheated me by changing my wages 10 times. However, God has not allowed him to harm me." So he knows that God's been watching out for him. And Jacob is obeying God. He's going to leave. And he recognizes past blessings that he's received from God. But there's not a solid connection to God. It's important to keep in mind that Jacob's name is pretty significant as we head towards this wrestling match that we're going to be looking at. Jacob, keep in mind, he was a twin. And during his birth, something unusual happened. This is back in Genesis 25. So we're going to go back in time a little bit. Genesis 25:24. Genesis chapter 25, verse 24 says, "When her days to be delivered were fulfilled, behold, there were twins in her womb. Now the first came forth red all over like a hairy garment, and they named him Esau. Afterward, his brother came forth with his hand holding on to Esau's heel. So his name was called Jacob." So you may know this, and I bet there's a footnote in your Bible that has at least some of this. Jacob means one who takes by the heel. And so that literally happened at his birth. But it also means one who supplants. Not a very common word, but that means to take somebody else's place, almost kind of steal their position. Both ideas work pretty together. The idea is that it's someone who's right on your heels because they're going to take your stuff. It's also translated as an overreacher, someone who's trying to trip you up. It's like that annoying guy in school who'd walk behind you and kind of trip you, except this guy, once you fall, he's going to steal your stuff. That's what Jacob means. And so he's kind of burdened with this stigma, but he lives up to his name. Later, when he tricks his dad into giving him Esau's blessing, Esau even comments on his brother's name. This is Genesis 27:36. We'll go a little farther back to where we were. Genesis 27:36. So this is after Jacob steals the blessing that belonged to Esau, and Esau makes this comment about his brother's name, and then he said, "Is he not rightly named Jacob? For he has supplanted or replaced me, what was rightfully mine, these 2 times. He took away my birthright, and behold, now he has taken away my blessing." Technically, this is not totally true, what he's saying. Esau squandered his birthright. Jacob did not take it. He made the most of an opportunity, but it was his own fault. Esau is held accountable for that later. But Jacob did use deception and stole his brother's blessing. Deception was kind of a family tradition. His grandfather Abraham did it. His father Isaac did it. And Jacob is defined by it, he's almost known as a manipulative thief. It's not a godly way of life. His father-in-law also thought of him as a manipulative thief. We're going back to Genesis 31, when that tension was building between the families, and Jacob packed up all his stuff, and they snuck out. They didn't tell him they were going. They just left. And so we get to Genesis 31:17. He's kind of slipping away, and it says, "Then Jacob put his children and his wives on camels, and he drove all his livestock ahead of him, along with all the goods he had accumulated in Padan Aram, to go to his father Isaac in the land of Canaan." So he's on the run. He's headed home. Verse 21, so he fled. So he's running. So he fled with all he had, crossed the Euphrates River, and headed for the hill country of Gilead. Laban, his father-in-law, finds out about it, finds out that he's slipped away, and he comes after him. It takes him a whole week, but he does catch up with him. And it's a pretty tense situation. And Jacob turns to face Laban, who's been tracking him. Genesis 31:36. "What is my crime?" he asked Laban. "How have I wronged you that you hunt me down?" And essentially the conversation is, Laban says, "Why did you sneak off like that?" Jacob says, I was afraid you wouldn't let me leave with Rachel and Leah. It's working for you the last 20 years has been kind of horrible. The only reason I have anything is because of God. That's essentially the conversation. And then verse 42, Genesis 31:42. "If the God of my father, the God of Abraham and the fear of Isaac, had not been with me, you would surely have sent me away empty-handed, but God has seen my hardship and the toil of my hands, and last night he rebuked you." God had warned Laban to lay off, do not mess with him. But again, notice in verse 42 there, Jacob says, "The God of my father." Jacob appreciates God's protection, but Jacob doesn't have his own relationship with God, at least not a solid one, it seems like. So things calm down with Laban, and Laban suggests a truce, and they sit down and they eat, and the next morning Laban goes home, and Jacob leaves all that stress behind. So keep that in mind. He's just left a very stressful situation, and he continues on toward home, and then something unusual happens. It's almost mentioned in passing. Angels show up. This is before the wrestling match. It's easy to miss. It's Genesis 32:1. "Now as Jacob went on his way, the angels of God met him." So when he wrestles that angel, it's not the first angel he's met. Not much is said about this encounter. I don't know much about it. The Bible doesn't say. And then Jacob continues to head for home. Last time he was there, his brother was ready to kill him. It's important to keep that in mind. So Jacob has a plan. He's going to send a message to Esau, and he sends it. And the message is essentially, "Are we okay? Or are we good?" And the messengers return with what sounds like some pretty bad news. This is Genesis 32:6. The messengers return to Jacob saying, "We came to your brother Esau, and furthermore, he's coming to meet you, and 400 men are with him. Are we good, Esau?" And the response is, "Here I come with 400 men." Esau is headed this way, and 400 guys are with him. This trip has already been stressful. Hunted down by his father-in-law on the leaving end of the trip, and the future looks worse. We know how this turns out. We know, but Jacob didn't. He probably only saw disaster ahead. So he comes up with a plan, and he's a good planner. Here's Genesis 32:7. Then Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed, and he divided the people who were with him, and the flocks and the herds and the camels, into two companies. For he said, if Esau comes to the one company and attacks it, then the company which is left will escape. He basically has all his eggs in one basket, so he divides them into two baskets, and that way he won't lose everything. Clearly, he's expecting an attack. And then he prays in verse 9. Here's Genesis 32:9. Jacob says, O God of my father Abraham, and God of my father Isaac, O Lord, who said to me, return to your country and to your relatives, and I will prosper you. I am unworthy of all the loving kindness and of all the faithfulness which you have shown to your servant. For with my staff only I crossed this Jordan, and now I've become two companies. Deliver me, I pray, from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him, that he will come and attack me and the mothers and the children. For you said, I will surely prosper you and make your descendants as the sand of the sea, which is too great to be numbered. He knows about the promise. This passage shows that he's afraid. It shows he has hope in God's promises, but it also shows that same distance. In verse 9, you noticed that I'm sure the God of my father. He starts strategizing again. He arranges hundreds of animals as gifts and sends them ahead in waves. And the plan, I guess, is to kind of wear down Esau with all these gifts. Here's 32:20. He sends the gifts and he sends these messengers. And you shall say, behold, your servant Jacob also is behind us. For he said, I will appease him with the present that goes before me. Then afterward I will see his face. Perhaps he will accept me. And he thinks that Esau is going to be traveling along and say, you know what? I was going to kill you, but these are some nice gifts, so I'm not going to kill you. Thank you. I think that's Jacob's plan. Night falls. Jacob is going to see Esau tomorrow. I bet all of you have had a night like that. I bet you can remember a night where you dreaded sunrise and it was almost impossible to sleep. That night he does some more strategy. He crosses the river with his family, and then he goes off alone. Then this is when it happens, something very strange. Genesis 32:24. Then Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. That's very odd, and there's a lot of details that are left out. There's questions that come to mind. But to understand what's going on and why this is significant, it's important to consider this from Jacob's point of view. In the recent past, there was major trouble. And in the near future, probably major trouble. So this is a turning point. This is kind of this intermission, I guess you could say. And God sends a representative. We know from other scripture this is an angel, which literally means messenger. So this man, this angel, has been sent to transfer information. That's what a messenger does. And at least part of the message comes in the form of a wrestling match. The match lasted for a while. We know it lasts until daybreak, but we only get the details of the ending. And here's Genesis 32:25. It's talking about the angel. When he saw that he had not prevailed against him, he touched the socket of his thigh. So the socket of Jacob's thigh was dislocated while he wrestled with him. If any of you have ever dislocated anything, I have. I bet you could start a club and empathize with each other. That gets your attention. The wrestling alone is surprising. What's really surprising is that it seems to be equally matched. In other places in the Bible, angels are destroying cities with a gesture. So either Jacob is really strong, or the angel is really weak, or maybe there's something else going on. This is all for Jacob. This is for him. He's in a tough spot. And so I got to thinking, I think we've seen this before. I think we've seen wrestling matches like this before. You've seen a father and a small son wrestling, and apparently the son is very strong. Seems like an equal match. The dad is just not able to overpower this amazing, powerful little boy. But we know that's not what's going on. And why are they wrestling? I was asking Sarah. We kind of had trouble kind of pinpointing exactly why do dads wrestle with their sons and let them win? For a little boy, I think it's something fun to interact with someone that powerful and survive. That's kind of nice. But it's important to know the dad is letting the son win because he's letting his son know what it feels like to win. But in this case, Jacob is going to sort of win. Possibly this is about building his confidence, but possibly it's also a reminder, at least the boy in this situation is being taught something more complicated. You can win, but don't forget you're not as strong as your father. Here God lets Jacob win a little, but he also leaves him with a reminder that he's not as strong as God. Then Jacob does what he has done before. He goes after the blessing. And the angel calls an end to the match. Here's Genesis 32:26. And he said, "Let me go, for the dawn is breaking." But he said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." This wrestling match, I believe, was meant to change Jacob. I think that's the purpose of its design. And the reason it happened right then is now he's going to be better prepared to face Esau, which is not even going to end up being a problem. It's dealing with the anxiety before the fact. And Jacob has changed more than one way. He's walking away with a limp. It's a reminder of who's really the most powerful. But he's also walking away with a new name. Here's Genesis 32:27. So he said to him, he's talking to the angel. I'm sorry, the angel's talking to him. "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." He said, "Your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel. For you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed." So consider his old name, what this change is going to mean. You're not going to be the supplanter anymore. You're not going to be the overreacher, the one who's tripping people up and taking their stuff. That's not you anymore. You're going to be Israel. Now remember, the promise to Abraham was the same promise passed on to Isaac. Someday, countless people, there'd be a nation that you couldn't even count. In fact, Jacob even refers to that. And here's the guy who will actually have the name of the promised land, of the promised nation. And he's not even fully on board yet. He keeps saying, "the God of my father." I think this wrestling match is about getting him on board. The angel of God changes Jacob's name to Israel, and Jacob decides to ask him his name. This is almost kind of funny in verse 29. Then Jacob asked him and said, "Please tell me your name," making introductions. But he said, "Why is it that you asked me my name?" And he blessed him there. It's almost as if the angel is saying, "We're not talking about my name. We're talking about your name." And when the wrestling match is over, Jacob gives a name to the place. He does not know the name of the angel, but he does name the place. He realizes this is a place where he could have died. He knows he could have lost this. Genesis 32, verse 30. So Jacob named the place Peniel, for he said, "I have seen God face to face, yet my life has been preserved." It's worth noticing names in the Bible. The name of this place, Peniel, it means the face of God. Those last two letters, E-L, that means God, the face of God. Years before this, after leaving home, Jacob named another place, Beth-El, the house of God, E-L at the end. Guess what his new name ends with? He's still a man on the periphery of having any real relationship with God, and now his name contains the name of God, Israel. He is a changed man, and his family knows it right away because even his walk is different. Genesis 32:31. Now the sun rose upon him just as he crossed over Peniel, and he was limping on his thigh. Right after this, Esau shows up. Jacob has literally changed overnight. He's still doing his strategizing. You'll notice that. It's almost like he can't keep his hands out of it. But he's going to find out all his strategies didn't even matter. Here's Genesis 34:1. And Jacob lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, Esau was coming, and 400 men with him. So he divided the children among Leah and Rachel and the two maids. He put the maids and their children in front, and Leah and her children next, and Rachel and Joseph last. And at first, when I remember reading this years ago, I thought, wow, this guy's not a nice guy. He's going to hide behind everybody. But notice, here's verse 3. But he himself passed on ahead of them and bowed down to the ground 7 times until he came near to his brother. This is the moment he's been dreading for a long, long time. He's invested a lot of worry, a lot of strategizing, and now we find out all his worries, all his strategies, all of it was for nothing. Verse 4, then Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. Everything's fine. No danger. In fact, Esau even says, don't worry about giving me all this stuff. But Jacob insists. And then he says something interesting. This is Jacob talking in verse 10, Genesis 34:10. Jacob said, no, please. If now I have found favor in your sight, then take my present from my hand, for I see your face as one sees the face of God, and you have received me favorably. He's saying seeing you, Esau, is like seeing the face of God, which I did last night in a very real way. Jacob spent his life being a heel catcher, a wrestler, a manipulator, a conniver, a strategizer. But with that wrestling match, God was trying to teach him something. He's still going to worry about stuff in the future. If you continue to read about Jacob, you'll discover that. But God is trying to teach him something that I think it's something that we should all learn. If you make God your God, if you get serious about it, instead of just maybe lounging on a basic belief, if you have a real relationship with him, you're going to prevail. You're going to win. But not because you worry enough and not because you have strength or because you're good at strategy. The only reason things will turn out well for you is determined by one simple thing, and it's whether or not you rely on God. I think that's part of what he learned that night. Jacob was worried about whether or not he and Esau were okay, but that was not the primary issue. The primary issue was always whether or not he and God were okay. And that's always the question for all of us. Are you okay with God? This wrestling match was supposed to be a turning point, a spiritual renovation. And we're faced with that often, whether it's through Scripture or the people in our lives. We're confronted with the reality of our Creator. It's quite possible for any of us to be in Jacob's position where God is the God of our father or the God of our parents or the God of our childhood. But then he never becomes our God. We might go to church, we might say we believe in him, but until we wrestle with the real issue, we'll face the future on our own. And like Jacob, we'll think that we can get the good stuff of the world through worldly tactics, manipulation, strategies, maybe even deception. But we need to listen to what God is telling us here. You will prevail. You will win, but it's not going to be because of your strength. It's going to be because of God's. All of us have challenges ahead, possibly even tomorrow, possibly even some real trouble. Maybe something like Jacob dreading Esau. You got a couple of options, at least that I can think of. You can wrestle with yourself, wrestle with your anxieties. You can fret and cobble together plan A and plan B and plan C. Or you could reconsider your life and make sure that you and God are okay and make sure that you're with him. When you're confirmed with the Creator, when you're confronted with him, you can't just walk away unchanged. You need him with you for what lies ahead. There are some things coming and you need him. At this point, only one strategic move makes sense, and that's to make yourself right with God. If you do that, you will prevail, you will win, and you'll reach the next life safe and sound. I hope this is of use to you as we stand together and sing.